Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a topic that's been generating a ton of buzz in our inbox lately, Brexit. It's been 5 years since the UK made the historic decision to leave the European Union. And, we've got a mountain of articles, reports, even some personal anecdotes from some of you out there. And we're going to try to sift through it all and see what's really happened since that fateful vote.
Yeah, it's certainly been a fascinating 5 years, to say the least. I mean, who could have predicted all the twists and turns? I'm really excited to dig into this and see what the data tells us.
All right, so let's rewind back to 2016. For those who might need a quick refresher, the UK decided to part ways with the European Union, a club they'd been a member of since 1973.
Right.
Now, being in the EU came with a whole host of perks, like zero tariffs on goods traded between member countries, easier travel and work opportunities across borders. I mean, the list goes on and on. So the big question is, why did the UK decide to call it quits? What were the main drivers behind this historic move?
Well, it's important to remember that while EU membership came with its share of advantages, those benefits did come at a cost.
Right.
As the EU expanded, so did its budget, and the UK, being one of the larger economies in the bloc, was expected to shoulder a bigger portion of the financial burden.
Makes sense.
And this idea that the UK was essentially subsidizing other countries started to rub some people the wrong way.
And that's where we see parties like UKIP, the UK Independence Party, really gaining traction. They were tapping into this growing sense of frustration, weren't they?
Absolutely. Their message resonated with voters who felt like the UK was losing its sovereignty and paying too much for the privilege of being in the EU. The 2004 European Parliament election was a real wake-up call. UKIP won a surprising number of seats, signaling that Euroscepticism was a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, it was a real turning point. Like, they threw a wrench into the UK's political machine. And even then, Prime Minister David Cameron felt the pressure right. He decided to call a referendum that once-in-a-lifetime vote, thinking it would appease his party and settle the EU question once and for all. Little did he know.
Yeah, it turned out to be a massive gamble that backfired spectacularly.
Big time.
The Leave campaign, fueled by this potent mix of economic anxieties and concerns about immigration, ultimately won the day, setting the stage for Brexit.
And immigration was definitely a hot-button issue during the campaign.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. In fact, you even sent me that controversial poster. Remember the one with a long queue of migrants and the caption "breaking point"? Mm-hmm. It really captured the sentiment at the time.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
But let's see what the data actually tells us. Because you also sent me this chart showing long-term net migration trends to the UK. And it seems like the reality is a bit more nuanced than that poster suggests.
Yeah, you're right. What's really striking is the surge in non-EU immigration after Brexit. In 2023, net migration from non-EU countries actually topped 900,000. That's triple what it was around the time of the Brexit vote.
Hold on, so you're saying immigration actually went up after Brexit? That's not what a lot of people were expecting?
Yeah, it's a bit of a counterintuitive trend, isn't it? While EU immigration did decrease, it was more than offset by this influx from non-EU countries.
Yeah.
If we take a look at the top 5 source countries for this post-Brexit immigration wave, we see India leading the pack with over 200,000 people, followed by Nigeria and Pakistan, each with over 100,000. China comes in fourth at just under 100,000, and Zimbabwe rounds out the top 5 at around 40,000.
Okay, so those are some big numbers, but what's driving this shift? Why this sudden surge from these specific countries?
Well, it's a combination of factors. The UK government introduced new visa programs after Brexit, specifically targeting skilled workers from outside the EU. They recognize the need to fill certain gaps in the labor market. At the same time, we can't ignore the global events happening around the world. Political instability in certain regions may have driven people to seek opportunities in the UK, a country with a long history of welcoming immigrants.
So it's not just a simple case of people coming for asylum or family reunification. There's a more complex interplay of economic needs, global events, and policy changes at play here. It seems like Brexit created a ripple effect, reshaping immigration in ways that few could have predicted.
Exactly.
And this brings us to another key area that was central to the Brexit debate, the National Health Service, or NHS. Remember that famous Leave campaign slogan promising to redirect $350 million a week money that was going to the EU back into the NHS?
Yeah.
It was a big promise that really resonated with voters concerned about the state of public health care in the UK.
Oh yeah, that 350 million for the NHS pledge. It was plastered on buses, billboards everywhere.
Everywhere you looked.
Yeah.
But did it actually materialize? Did the NHS see this promised windfall after Brexit? You sent over some data on this, didn't you?
I did. We have a chart here showing total NHS spending from 2010 to 2023. And while there was a significant increase in spending, particularly in 2021, the spike was largely due to emergency funding in response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So the pandemic kind of threw a wrench into things, making it harder to isolate the impact of Brexit on NHS funding.
Precisely. But if we look beyond the exceptional spending driven by the pandemic, we see that NHS funding has essentially continued to grow at a rate that's largely in line with historical trends. There wasn't this massive injection of funds directly attributable to Brexit that some were expecting.
So the reality is a bit more nuanced than that catchy slogan suggested.
Right, and that raises another important question. If the NHS didn't get that extra 350 million a week, where did all the money the UK was contributing to the EU actually go?
Yeah, show me the money, right? We're talking billions here. Let's break it down. What were the UK's contributions to the EU over time?
Okay, so we have this chart that shows the UK's gross contributions to the EU budget from 1973 to 2020. As you can see, those contributions steadily increased over the years, reaching a peak of 23 billion in 2020.
Okay, so that's the money going out. But wasn't there also money coming back to the UK in the form of rebates and EU funds?
You're absolutely right. The chart actually breaks down those rebates and the EU money that flowed back to the UK. But the key point here is that even with those rebates and EU funding the UK's net contribution, the difference between what it paid in and what it received kept growing. It peaked at around 13 billion in 2020.
So even with some money coming back, the UK was still sending a sizable chunk of change to Brussels every year. And the argument from the Leave campaign was that this money could be better spent on domestic priorities like the NHS.
Exactly. The idea was that leaving the EU would free up significant funds that could be redirected towards bolstering public services or investing in other areas. But as we've seen with the NHS spending data, the reality is more complex than that simple equation.
It seems like the economic consequences of Brexit are far more intricate than some may have initially imagined. But let's talk about trade. Another major talking point in the whole Brexit debate.
Yes, trade. Probably the biggest question mark hanging over Brexit.
I mean, would leaving the EU's single market and customs union lead to a trade boom or a trade bust? It was a nail-biter for many businesses.
Definitely. And, you sent over a really interesting chart that tracks quarterly changes in UK exports to the EU. It really tells two different stories, one for goods and one for services.
Okay, so let's break it down. What does this chart reveal?
Well, for starters, it shows that goods exports to the EU have actually fallen since Brexit. British companies selling physical products like manufactured goods are now facing more barriers and costs when trying to reach their European customers.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, no more frictionless trade within the single market.
Exactly. But here's the surprise. Services exports have actually risen since Brexit.
Wait, really? How is that even possible?
It seems counterintuitive, but there's a logical explanation. Many services, particularly those offered by London's financial markets, are still in high demand across the EU. European businesses still rely on these specialized services, even with Brexit in place.
So they're essentially forced to import them from the UK, even though it's outside the EU. That's fascinating. It really underscores the complexity of global trade and the continued importance of certain UK sectors like finance.
Exactly.
Right.
And it also highlights how Brexit has reshaped trading patterns in ways that many hadn't anticipated.
Definitely. It seems like Brexit has created both opportunities and challenges for UK businesses. But what about the overall economic impact? Did the UK government do any analysis on the potential gains and losses from Brexit?
They did. They conducted an impact assessment to try and quantify the effects of Brexit on the economy, weighing the potential benefits from new trade deals struck outside the EU against the losses from leaving the single market. And you actually sent over a table summarizing their findings.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So what was the bottom line?
Well, their analysis estimated a negative impact of 100 billion from Brexit, outweighing the benefits of new trade deals. That translates to a 4% hit to GDP.
Wow. 4% of GDP. That's a significant number.
Yeah.
It really underscores the economic costs associated with leaving the EU's integrated market.
But let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. How has the UK's overall economic growth fared since the Brexit vote? Well, we have a chart here tracking the UK's GDP growth from 2013 onwards. Looking at the years around the Brexit vote, we see some fluctuations. In 2016, growth was 1.9%, followed by 2.7% in 2017, then dipping to 1.4% in 2018, and recovering slightly to 1.8% in 2019.
Okay, so a bit of a roller coaster ride there. What happened in 2020 and beyond?
Well, 2020 was the year the COVID-19 pandemic hit, causing a sharp global recession. The UK, like many other countries, experienced a severe economic contraction.
Right, that was a rough year for everyone.
It was. But then, in 2021, we see a dramatic rebound with GDP growth surging to 8.6%.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
It was an unusual year fueled by pent-up demand as economies reopened and people rushed to spend their savings. This momentum continued into 2022 with growth at a still robust 4.8%. However, things cooled down considerably in 2023 with growth slowing to a mere 0.3%. And the latest estimates for 2024 suggest a modest recovery to 0.85%, but even that figure is surrounded by uncertainty.
So it seems like after that initial post-pandemic surge, the UK economy has settled into a more sluggish growth pattern. Not exactly the booming Brexit economy that some people predict.
You got it. It's a much more complex picture than many had envisioned. Brexit has undoubtedly reshaped the UK's economic landscape, but its full effects are still unfolding.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating to see how those initial promises and anxieties around Brexit have played out in such unexpected ways. I mean, who could have predicted that immigration would actually increase?
Yeah.
Or that the NHS wouldn't see this massive windfall?
It just goes to show that disentangling a country from a deeply integrated economic and political bloc like the EU is a complex process with ripple effects that are difficult to fully anticipate.
Absolutely. And speaking of ripple effects, let's dive into another key area that was hotly debated during the Brexit campaign trade. You shared some interesting charts that break down how Brexit has impacted the UK's trading relationships.
Right. We were just talking about how goods exports to the EU have actually declined since Brexit. But you also sent over a chart that shows the UK's current top trading partners. I'm curious to see how things have shifted since the UK left the EU's single market.
Okay, let's take a look. All right, so the EU as a whole is still the UK's biggest trading partner, but it now accounts for less than 50% of UK exports. That's a significant drop from pre-Brexit levels.
It is. And if we look at individual countries, the US has emerged as the UK's top trading partner, followed by Germany, then the Netherlands, Ireland, and France.
Interesting that all of those countries, except for the US, are still part of the EU. It seems like the EU remains a crucial trading bloc for the UK, even post-Brexit.
It does. But this shift towards the U.S. as the UK's top trading partner comes with its own set of challenges and uncertainties.
You're talking about those Trump tariffs we discussed earlier, right?
Right.
The ones imposed by the former U.S. president on certain UK exports.
Exactly. Those tariffs pose a significant risk to UK businesses exporting goods to the U.S. market. And it highlights the potential volatility of relying too heavily on any single trading partner, particularly one that's prone to protectionist policies.
Right, so while the U.S. market presents opportunities, there's also a degree of risk involved. It seems like the UK is navigating a complex new trading landscape as it forges new partnerships outside the EU.
It is. And this brings us back to the question of the UK's overall economic performance since Brexit. We were looking at GDP growth figures earlier, and it seems like the picture is a bit mixed.
Yeah, we saw that after a brief post-pandemic boom, growth has slowed considerably in recent years. What's the outlook for the UK economy moving forward?
Well, the latest projections suggest a modest recovery in 2024, but there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the UK's economic future. The long-term impacts of Brexit are still unfolding, and it's too early to say definitively whether it will ultimately lead to greater prosperity or economic stagnation.
It seems like we're still in the early chapters of this Brexit saga. There's so much more to unfold and so many factors at play.
Exactly, and that's what makes this such a fascinating topic to analyze. We're witnessing a historic shift in the UK's political and economic landscape, and the data helps us track those changes and understand their implications.
It's like watching a slow-motion domino effect as the consequences of Brexit continue to ripple outwards. I'm curious what surprised you the most as we've delved into all of this data and analysis.
For me, it's the stark contrast between the pre-Brexit rhetoric and the post-Brexit reality. Take immigration, for example. Many people voted to leave the EU based on the belief that it would significantly reduce immigration levels.
And that infamous poster with the long queue of migrants certainly played on those fears.
It did. But as we saw in the data, overall immigration actually increased after Brexit, largely driven by an influx from non-EU countries.
Yeah, it's a reminder that complex issues like immigration are rarely black and white, and that simple solutions often fail to address the underlying complexities.
Precisely. And it highlights the importance of looking beyond the headlines and digging into the data to get a clearer picture of what's really happening.
Absolutely. Another area where the reality has diverged from the pre-Brexit rhetoric is the NHS. That pledge to redirect $350 million a week into the NHS was a powerful campaign message.
It was. And it resonated with many voters who are concerned about the state of healthcare in the UK.
But as we saw in the spending data, there hasn't been this massive Brexit-related boost to NHS funding.
Right. The reality is more nuanced. While NHS spending has increased, that increase is largely in line with historical trends, not due to some sudden influx of money freed up by Brexit.
It's a reminder that we should always scrutinize political promises, no matter how appealing they may sound.
Absolutely. And we should always look beyond catchy slogans to understand the complex realities behind those promises.
So to recap, we've seen that Brexit has had a multifaceted impact on the UK. It's reshaped immigration patterns in unexpected ways. It hasn't delivered the promised windfall for the NHS, and it's created a new, more complex trading landscape for UK businesses.
And while we've gained some valuable insights by looking at the data, we're still in the early stages of understanding the full scope of Brexit's consequences.
Yeah, it's a story that's still being written, and it will be fascinating to see how it unfolds in the years to come.
I agree. And it's a story that underscores the interconnectedness of global events and the importance of critical thinking and data analysis in navigating a world of ever-increasing complexity.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But hey, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I think it's time for a little break. We'll be back in a bit to continue our deep dive into Brexit. Stay tuned.
Sounds good.
It really feels like we've just scratched the surface of this whole Brexit saga. There's so many layers to unpack, from the economic and political ramifications to the social and cultural shifts that are still unfolding.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're living through a period of profound change, and events like Brexit have a way of shaking things up and revealing the fault lines in our societies.
And it's a testament to your curiosity that you're taking the time to delve into all of this to really understand the complexities of this historic decision and its ongoing impacts.
Well, I think it's essential to engage with these complex issues, to move beyond the simplistic narratives and really grapple with the nuances.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the most valuable things we've done in this deep dive is to challenge some of those simplistic narratives that often surround Brexit.
Right. We've seen how the reality on the ground often differs from the pre-referendum predictions, whether it's immigration, NHS funding, or the overall economic impact.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we should always approach complex issues with a healthy dose of skepticism and a willingness to look beyond the headlines.
Absolutely. And we should never underestimate the power of data and analysis to help us cut through the noise and make sense of these complex issues.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Brexit 5 years, on what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that Brexit is not a singular event with a clear-cut outcome. It's an ongoing process with far-reaching consequences that will continue to shape the UK's political, economic, and social landscape for years to come.
It's a journey with many twists and turns, and we're still in the early stages of that journey.
Exactly. And as with any journey, it's important to be aware of the potential pitfalls and opportunities that lie ahead.
So what advice would you give to our listener as they continue to navigate this complex post-Brexit world?
I would encourage them to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to approach these issues with an open mind and a willingness to challenge their own assumptions.
I love it. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious. Those are words to live by, especially in today's world.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this fascinating deep dive into Brexit. It's been a pleasure exploring these complex issues with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights and food for thought. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, to dig deeper, to question assumptions, and to form your own conclusions.
Because that's what the deep dive is all about, empowering you to navigate the complexities of the world around you.
Thanks for listening. And until next time, happy exploring. Wow, it really feels like we've only just started to unravel this whole Brexit thing. I mean, there's so much more to it than meets the eye, all the economic and political stuff, and then the social and cultural changes that are still happening.
Absolutely. It's a huge reminder that we're living in a time of massive change. And, things like Brexit, they really shake things up, expose all the cracks in society.
Yeah, for sure. And it says a lot about you that you're so curious about all this. Taking the time to really dig into this historic decision and figure out what it all means.
Well, I think it's so important to really engage with these complex issues We can't just settle for the easy answers. We have to grapple with the nuances.
Couldn't agree more. And, one of the best things about this deep dive has been challenging those simplistic narratives that always seem to pop up around Brexit.
Right. We've seen how the reality on the ground is often totally different from what people were predicting before the referendum, whether it's immigration, NHS funding, or the overall economic impact.
It's a good reminder that we should always be a little skeptical. Approach these big issues with an open mind and look beyond the headlines.
Absolutely. And never underestimate the power of data and analysis to help us cut through all the noise and figure out what's really going on.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Brexit 5 years later, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that Brexit isn't just a one-time event with a clear-cut outcome. It's an ongoing process with consequences that will continue to shape the UK for years to come, politically, economically, socially, you name it.
It's like a journey with all these twists and turns, and we're still at the very beginning.
Exactly. And just like with any journey, it's crucial to be aware of the potential risks and the opportunities that lie ahead.
So what advice would you give to our listeners as they navigate this new post-Brexit world?
I would say stay informed, engage in thoughtful conversations, and approach these issues with an open mind. Be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
I love that. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious. Great advice, especially these days.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Brexit. It's been a real pleasure exploring all this with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some insights and something to think about. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic. Dig deeper, question those assumptions, and come to your own conclusions.
Because that's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the tools to understand and navigate our complex world.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and until next time, keep exploring.